All right, guys, we are back. Before you jump into this lecture, make sure you've done the readings for this week. That should be done before you watch this. So the Boyd, Richardson, and Henrik paper, we're going to be alluding back to it in this. It's going to presume some knowledge from that paper, so make sure you read that one first. Now, it is a dense paper, you will have noticed, just like the Pinker paper. And as a result, for the next 2 weeks, your readings are pretty light. They're not actually readings at all. They're just a podcast and then a video. But this particular one is very important. And the reason for that is because it really does introduce the next stage of evolutionary psychology. This is the most exciting stuff that's going on in the field. And that's about cultural evolution. So what the Boyd et al. Paper introduces is the idea of dual inheritance theory. And what we're talking about here is that we as humans are no longer just driven by genes. We have a second lineage that we inherit from our parents other than our genes, and that is culture. So dual inheritance theory is about the fact that human evolution is the product not just of our genetic lineage, but of our cultural lineage. And in particular, that culture seems to evolve in a roughly, though only roughly, analogous way to genetic evolution. It has the three critical, sufficient, and necessary mechanisms of genetic evolution, which is variation. There are variations in the ideas that are produced, the approaches to farming, the ways of tying a knot. Different types of languages emerge, different types of religions emerge, and then there is selection among those. Certain types of ideas or technologies or values or techniques are passed down in time more than others. Why? Well, because they're more memorable or because they work better. And finally, transmission. There is this idea of cultural transmission that we, just as we send our genes down to our children, we spread ideas from mind to mind. So cultural information that proves to be useful or just memorable or just sticky gets passed down to the next generation through social learning. Social learning, as you recall, is something that was talked about a lot in that paper. We'll talk a lot more about it in this lecture. Also talked about in that paper was the idea that culture progresses through the accumulation of small improvements. You think about the bow and arrow or the igloo structures that the authors talk about with regards to the Inuit. These were things that were refined bit by bit over thousands of years to the point where now they are these incredibly complex technologies that could not have been come up by any single genius 100 or 1,000 years ago or even now, but instead were the product of these refinements, lots of people working on them, accumulating over a long period of time. And what that means is that these small improvements don't require, say, the person from 400 years ago having this prescient view of what the bow and arrow will become in 400 years. Instead, they're just trying to make a little tweak to make it a little better, to make the arrow shoot a little further, or to make it a little more comfortable, or to make it a little more efficient in its use of materials. It doesn't need prescience. It doesn't need great leaps of genius. It just needs to be improved bit by bit and aggregated over a long period of time. You have amazing cultural innovations that have been produced. Now, the other thing that means is that we don't always have to understand how a thing is great for us to develop something that's great. This is the same product as you see in evolution. There's the saying that evolution is smarter than you are, in that you see across the animal kingdom all sorts of crazy innovations that work in ways that we haven't really figured out yet because they're incredibly complex. They've been designed through trial and error. They exist because they work. Doesn't care if we understand it or not. Cultural innovations can operate in the same way. We might not be able to explain why this particular bow and arrow works better. We might not be able to understand why we do this particular cooking technique, and yet it does serve a purpose, even if we don't understand what that purpose is. that's something we'll return to probably next week. Now, why did this happen? How did we end up in a situation, how did our species in particular end up in a species that has this dual inheritance, that also has this ability to develop cumulative culture through the process of aggregated social learning? Well, let's look at the time frame in which this was likely to happen. Let's look at the time frame that really differentiates us from all the other species on the planet. What is it anatomically that differentiates us? Well, these giant brains. When did that happen? Roughly in this 4 million year range, and in particular in that 2 million year to now range. In that time, you saw an enormous amount of climactic variability. The environments that humans were living in changed rapidly. This is a little hard to read, one, because it's very low resolution, but two, because it sort of seems backwards. So you can see as you go further out on the x-axis, you're going further and further back in time. So let's just flip it. Doesn't improve the resolution, but now what you see is that at the very start of the chart on the left is 3 million years ago, and 0 is now. And you can see over this time, the mean temperature would whipsaw back and forth. We, as humans, were living in a rapidly changing environment. So that's what our environment was going through during the time when we developed our hyperintelligence, at least during the time when we developed these very large brains. So why is that the case? Why is that relevant? Well, the thing about a rapidly changing environment is it means that it makes genetic evolution less able to produce adaptations that are going to work in your particular new environment. Remember, there's a time lag to genetic evolution. It requires your environment to be reasonably stable to go through the process of building an adaptation that actually works for that environment. Imagine it's the case that, well, it gets very cold for a few generations. And then the people who, have the best cold threshold are the people who out-survive those who have a weaker cold threshold, who are built for warmer environments. Well, that's great, unless the temperature whipsaws back to being warm again, and now all you've done, you've killed off all the people who are able to withstand warmth. You're stuck with all these people who are really good in the cold, but now the temperature has actually changed. Your environment's changed, and what evolution actually had selected for no longer fits the environment. You're mismatched to the environment. So in rapidly changing environments, there isn't time for you to develop genetic adaptations to those environments, unless the adaptation that you're outfitted with doesn't allow you to deal with any single environment, but actually allows you to flexibly deal with changing environments themselves. And so any genetic adaptation that didn't fit one or the other of these rapidly flipping back and forth environments, but actually allowed you to deal with all the environments, would actually be what was selected for. In other words, the environment that we were adapted to was not hot or cold, but change itself. Now, what adaptations would those have been? And this is where we start talking about social learning. So social learning, the ability to learn from what other people have already learned, turns out to be an incredibly effective psychological adaptation when your environment is at a particular level of variability. So imagine that you have a spectrum whereby the environment gets more and more variable as you move to the right, which is also to say that as you move to the left, you have a more predictable long-term environment, which is to say that the environment as it is at generation 0 is kind of like very similar to what the environment is like at generation 100 or 1000. And so on the very left, you have a similar environment for hundreds of thousands of generations, and on the right, you have a different environment every 2 or 3 generations. As we talked about, the utility of genetic evolution, whereby you are outfitted through genetic evolution with adaptations that fit your particular environment, that is most useful when you have this long-term predictable environment. Because It takes a while for you to develop the adaptation, and it's still going to be useful for many generations thereafter, so long as your environment stays the same. On the other side of the spectrum, if your environment is changing every few generations, it's actually not worth spending the time to develop genetic adaptations. They're always going to be lagging behind. And it's actually not even worth listening to what the ancestors say. Because what the ancestors say, they said it in a different environment than the one that you're inheriting. You're in a novel environment, and you're best off just relying on yourself to learn whatever you have to do in this particular new environment. But social learning is most effective in the in-between zone. When your environment is not so long-term and stable and predictable that you could just rely on genetic adaptations, but it's not so variable that what previous generations learned and what previous generations are telling you is not completely useless because you're in a brand new environment where you have to do all the learning yourself. In that in-between zone, the environment changes too fast for genetic evolution, but the wisdom that grandma learned from her grandma is still actually relevant to what the environment is like now. You still have the same climate and plants around to cook the same thing that your great-great-grandma cooked. The environment hasn't changed that much. And so you benefit from learning from the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. You don't have to learn everything anew yourself. So the development of our ability to be a social learning creature played a major role in our recent human evolution. So much so that it actually requires us to revise a bunch of the stuff that we've already learned. If you've read the Boyd et al. Paper, you see how it sort of knocks out Pinker's idea of how and why humans are intelligent. Pinker made the argument that Boyd et al. Dismisses being nativist. Pinker made the argument that our intelligence allows us to come up with all these solutions in the moment with our own minds. Boyd et al. Say, no, that's not right. What our intelligence is about learning from each other, because to be the humans that we are, to live in the multitude of environments in which we live, requires more than just us individually learning as every single person, learning anew from the environment in the moment, and then that knowledge dying out when we die. No, instead, what we are creatures that accumulate knowledge by passing it between and across generations. And that's what enables us to live in this multitude of environments. It also requires us to revise our understanding of why we developed so large a brain. We talked about a few theories. We talked about Alfred Russel Wallace's creationist theory of how we develop the higher mental faculties. We talked about the Darwin/Fisher sexual selection theory. We talked about Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis. But now we're going to revise it a little more and talk about the cultural brain hypothesis. In this view, it was actually the development of social learning that drove this massive expansion in our brains over the last 2 million years. How did it happen? Well, imagine that you have these parallel tracks of genetic evolution shaping us, but also cultural evolution shaping us. And moreover, genetic evolution enables cultural evolution, but then the cultural innovations we make as a species feeds back into our genetic selection, actually changing our anatomical selves. This process by which cultural innovations can feed back into changing the gene pool is called gene-culture coevolution. And one a clear example is the cultural innovation of fire and cooking. That was something that we're not born able to do, but we figured out about 1 million years ago. And when we figured it out, it changed our diet considerably. It changed our diet so much that our body, our anatomy, adapted to our new cultural ability to cook. Our jaws shrunk, our teeth shrunk, our guts shrunk, all because we didn't need to do the digestion ourselves, because we were pre-digesting the food by cooking it. We could extract the same, actually more nutrients with less anatomical hardware to actually drive it. And what that meant is it freed up a bunch of energy to enlarge in our brains. And so in that sense, a cultural innovation fed back into our genetic evolution, something called, as we talked about, gene-culture coevolution. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's talk about how this went step by step. Somewhere in our primate history, we developed hands. Hands are effective for doing all sorts of things. When we were living in trees, they allow us to climb the trees, they allow us to swing to the trees. It's good to have hands. However, the purpose of our hands changed a little bit when we evolved terrestriality, when we came down from the trees. So we see a lot of our primate cousins, they live entirely arboreally up in the trees. Chimpanzees tend to be semi-arboreal, semi-terrestrial. Humans, terrestrial. We live on the ground. Once you're on the ground, hands can do other things. There's a lot more tools, potential tools that you can work with on the ground. There's more rocks that you can use, and eventually you can fashion your own tools when you're living on the ground. So the combination of having hands free and living on the ground, something that happened to humans and to some extent chimpanzees, that allowed for this path towards our first technology, our first cultural innovation, which was tools. The other thing that terrestriality added was we now faced a much larger and more dangerous set of predators. We faced in the African savanna where we were all the vicious cats as well as the wild wolf-like dog creatures that existed at the time. That pressure of predation led us to find safety in numbers and live in larger groups. So the combination of these two factors led to larger groups and tools. This kicked off a process by which our brain started to grow. Once we started developing tools about 2 million years ago, what happened was that created a selection pressure for people who could build better tools. It meant that the people who had slightly bigger brains were now had more of an evolutionary advantage, had more of a selective advantage because it mattered more to have that ability to manipulate things out in an environment, tool use. It also led to an increase in brain growth because of the larger groups that we lived in. The combination of that allowed for rudimentary social learning. We learned about our tools from other people. So this led to larger brains with social learning capacities. Like I said, the pressure for brains to be able to do more, in particular to learn more from other people, and potentially even to transmit more to other people, led to these increasing selection pressures for larger brains. Once you had those larger brains, that enabled more sophisticated cultural innovations. So that led to things like fire and cooking, which we just talked about. Once you had that particular innovation, that enabled us to shift our diet, to, as I mentioned, redirect metabolic energy from an expensive digestive gut system, freeing it up to be used by metabolically even more expensive brains. And so that led to even larger brains with even more social learning expertise. It also meant that with these large brains, we had extended juvenile periods. We had to invest more in the children and to build these large brain children. And also as the group sizes increased, male reproductive strategies shifted. It was less incentivized to be the dominant male because now you had more and more people you had to fight off. And it made more sense to engage in pair bonding with particular females instead of trying to be the one guy to have all the females and not invest in all the children. So it shifted more towards male investment in the children and allowed for more sharing of parental duties among the women, alloparenting as we've talked about. All those things led to even more cultural innovations, even more sophisticated cultural innovations, which again rewarded through evolutionary selection even more driving of an increased brain growth. So you see how there's this iterative, positive feedback process. As soon as brains improve and increase in size, It enables cultural evolution to expand the pool of information, which then provides more selection for better learning and thus pressure for brain growth. One thing leads to another, which feeds back and leads to even more and more and more, and you get this upward spiral. So in a sense, in the words of Henrich, the process has now become autocatalytic. It produces its own fuel to grow even further. So this increased cultural sophistication again drives the selection for an even bigger brain, but at some point we hit the obstetric's dilemma and we reach the anatomical constraints on building larger brains. And at that point, this sharp increase in our brain growth stops. However, that doesn't stop our innovation, because at this point, the social learning abilities of the brain are such that we can keep innovating higher and higher, accumulating more and more cultural innovations on top of each other. So this leads ultimately, even though there's no more genetic selection for larger brains, it still leads to an improvement in our cultural repertoire, to religion, to large cities, eventually to figuring out the theory of evolution, etc. And so that narrow evolutionary path to culture, in which we just happened to be a species that evolved hands and then came down to the trees during this time of climactic variability, eventually led to this tipping point, at which point this runaway process took over, where the brain, the large enough brain, allowed for cultural innovations, which prompted more selection pressures for larger brains, allowing more cultural innovations, and so on. And what that leaves us is with not just this rapidly increased genetic individual brain we have, but perhaps more importantly, the cultural brain, the collective brain, the amount of information that is distributed among our entire species, rather than just that's contained within any single brain. And what that means is that the ability to transmit culture between us is our greatest psychological adaptation. And that's what we'll talk about in the next lecture.